Earthlings, welcome to yet another vegan time tunnel. You're very welcome as ever. Actually, my computer is playing up a little bit, so I'm hoping that we're not going to have any technical issues, but you'll be the first to know, I'm sure. Okay, so I think we've got my fourth or fifth time tunnel interviews today, which is really good. Just to remind people that if you're watching this on anything other than my YouTube channel, then that's the best place to go for the chat if you want to interact with the chat. And then for everybody, feel free to comment, because we don't charge people to do that and have your questions and comments, etc., put on the screen. So feel free to do all of that. Now, the format today is we're going to do a very brief little interview with our guest, who I'm going to introduce in a second, and then he's got a PowerPoint to show us. Now, it's also probably the case that we're probably going to have to do this over 2 weeks, because the PowerPoint is quite a long one, and that's because this story is absolutely remarkable, quite an epic, actually. So without further ado, as they say, I'm going to bring in the guests. So here we go. Hey, hello, Mark.
Hi, Roger. How you doing?
How are you doing? Thanks very much for doing this. So do you want to tell the world where you're transmitting from?
Right. Currently, I'm beside a rainforest west of Auckland in New Zealand.
All right.
And it's summertime here. So
what does it mean to be by a rainforest?
So we're at the very edge of the suburb. So the road I'm on is the very last road before you. I'm looking out the window now at just a huge expanse of rainforest between here and the coast. It's really amazing.
Oh wow. Okay. And you know, there's all these kind of stereotypical things about what a rainforest is. So what is it? What is it like?
It's actually how Ireland was before farmers got there. Ireland was a rainforest island as well. It's basically a forest with tons of rain. That's all it is, really. And this place has got tons of both. Ireland is one of the rare exceptions in the EU that's only got 1% of its forestry left. The average is about 11%. So Ireland used to be a rainforest too. It's got plenty of rain, but less forest now.
Yeah, it's funny actually, because I don't suppose many people will kind of realize that. And also, Sentient Rights Ireland did do a session last night with someone who's making that very point about that, because obviously the English, they tried to make Ireland essentially into a cattle farm, didn't they? And so they shipped the humans out and brought the cows in, you know, that kind of stuff.
That's right. Yeah.
So, hi, Kate. Well, yeah, you can watch it on catch up, and it's going to be over 2 weeks as well. So it's quite interesting, because next week will be the second day of November. So it's the second day of World Vegan Month. So I've got a special going to be running on World Vegan Day itself, the first. And we have a special guest, Wendy. We had to cancel that the other day, but it's also going to, I'm thinking of doing something like a 12-hour live stream, including the Wendy one. I've actually written to the BBC. Well, I wrote to Simon Amstell's management to try and get the rights to show Carnage, because it's not being shown very much. But they don't have them, so they suggested I contact the BBC, which I have. They haven't replied, so whether that'll all work out, I don't know. But it'd be quite good to show Carnage, because I think apart from its original airing on the BBC, I don't think many people have seen it, on the grounds that it's one of those that the BBC always removed from wherever it might be put up, you know, Vimeo or YouTube, that kind of stuff, one of those kind of things. Right, okay. Well, I want to ask you a couple of questions before we start then, Mark. I mean, first of all, your project has got a really impressive scope. I mean, we talk about 200 years, right? So kind of what prompted that, and the second part of it is the focus on Ireland. Why both those? The size and the focus on Ireland.
Okay. I think if we start with the PowerPoint now, and if I lead you through the photographs that I have accumulated as I was doing this research, and it will help explain the origins of the idea for the book and illustrate some examples from the book as well.
Yeah, so, good idea.
Yeah. So if we go in through here. So a couple of years back, I was invited on to a podcast called Policed, which is a podcast that's still running, where Irish citizens get interviewed about their experience with the Garda Síochána, the Irish police, across various issues. So there was abortion rights, there was travellers' rights, and I was invited on to speak about animal rights because I was involved in the embryonic hunt saboteurs movement in Southern Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland, around the mid-90s. Hunt sabotage had been quite common in the north of Ireland for quite some time, but had only recently spread south. And I had helped set up a group in Galway because I had some experience sabbing over in Edinburgh with the Scottish Sabs a few years previous. So we went out on a bunch of sabs against the Galway Blazers. We were duly ambushed and had the merry hell kicked out of us in front of the police. And that prompted the invite onto the police podcast, where I was talking about my interactions and experience with the police after the attack and trying to get charges pressed and so on. So as I was doing some research before the interview, I was looking online to see what had happened to the hunt sabotage movement following that attack, because I had emigrated to the UK about 3 or 4 months after that attack, and I'd lost contact with the movement in Ireland. Really, I was very involved in the UK movement, but I'd lost contact with anyone involved in the Irish movement. So I went online to see what I could find. And I stumbled across an archive. So this is some of the stuff I came across in the archive. There's an online archive called the Irish Newspaper Archive, and it's an online resource of every newspaper ever printed in Ireland since I think the very first one was the Belfast Telegraph in 1738 or something. Every newspaper ever printed in Ireland ever since, up till yesterday, is out there, and they've got a really good search engine. So if you put in a few primary words like animal liberation or animal liberation front or hunt sabotage, tons of stuff came up. I was stunned by this. I'd been involved in hunt sabotage and legal campaigning in Ireland for many years, and I hadn't heard about almost any of these actions at all. So bearing in mind that at the time, before the internet, information was really parochial. So if an action happened and got reported in, for instance, the Connacht Tribune or something, unless you lived in that area and had access to that newspaper, then you didn't get a chance to read it. So information was very fragmented, very temporary. So it was really hard to have an idea of what was going on really then. So when I went online and I came across all these hundreds, maybe thousands of articles, opinion pieces, letters to the editor, exposés, reportage of loads and loads of many small-scale actions being done on behalf of animals in Ireland on both sides of the border. From the 1980s, I'd say it peaked around the mid-90s, and from around 2010 onwards, it's really been in a very sharp decline. So it was really fascinating for me to come across this history. And the more I went online and looked into it, the more characters I was coming across. So, for instance, the very first mention of a vegan anywhere in Ireland was actually around the 17th century. There was a guy called Robert Linnan Cook, who was probably the only vegan in Ireland at the time. He was originally a wool trader from Wexford, and then converted to veganism, even though the word wasn't around then. He was essentially a straight edge vegan, what we would now call a straight edge vegan. So he didn't drink, didn't take any drugs. I think there was only drink then, and was a strict vegan. So he was very much like the modern age straight edge movement, which was an offshoot of the anarcho-punk movement around the 1980s, where they didn't drink and they didn't do drugs, and they're all hardcore vegan, and it was called straight edge. So Robert Lyndon Cook was probably the first mention of a straight edge character before that term was invented, centuries before that term was invented, and he was famous in the area for a while, and there was things written about him. He was a very unique character. Story goes that once his farm hands caught a fox that was wandering around his farm, and instead of killing the fox, which is the usual response from a farmer then and now, I would say, Robert Cook came out and lectured him on the commandment of "Thou shalt not kill," and then they formed a line. The workers and farmers, they formed a line for like a gauntlet for the fox to run through as they struck the fox, and then allowed the fox to escape. So they punished the fox for being on the farm, but they wouldn't kill the fox, and then they allowed him to escape. They made him run the gauntlet and escape. So I don't know if we'd be advocating that.
Well, it's a novel approach, isn't it?
It is a novel approach, and it was very unique then and now. So it just goes to show that even going way back, there was this sort of line of thinking, but it wasn't until the guy on the bottom here, which is Richard Hair Trigger Martin, which is where the name of the book came from. The guy on top, Thomas Wentworth, was the Lord Deputy of Ireland, which was a position given to Englishmen who were the representative of the Crown in Ireland. And this guy had complete control, as if he was the King of Ireland at the time. So he had come over from England, where practices like tying your plow to the tail of the cow rather than to a strap around the cow was banned and hadn't been used for a very long time. Whereas in Ireland, it was endemic, and the reason for that is because the Irish, they were so piss poor they couldn't afford anything, so they had to tie these plows to the tails of these beasts, which caused immense pain to the bulls and cows, obviously. But it was done out of necessity, it seemed, rather than anything else. So anyway, it was banned by Thomas Wentworth, and it is regarded as the first piece of state legislation forbidding particular acts of violence against particular animals, and that was in 1635. So the Wentworth Act precedes the Martin Act by about 2 centuries, and is therefore the very first state law around animal welfare. But it was Trigger Martin, the guy on the bottom here, that really set the ball rolling. This was a guy who was really passionate about animal welfare, not animal rights. He was a fox hunter himself. Okay, so he was very much a man of his time, but he was very much ahead of the curve at the same time. So he would spend his weekends chasing and shooting foxes in his vast country estates in Galway, and he would during the week he would be prosecuting for beating up donkeys in the courts as soon as he got his bill pushed through. So Richard Martin was an MP and a landlord in West Galway, a man of huge wealth and power, so much power that he had the right to draft and enact his own laws in his fiefdom. Essentially, it was an archaic law.
He had a kind of prison, didn't he? I think you've got a slide coming up with it.
That's right. He set up the world's first prison here, which is in a tiny islet in, what's the name of the Ballynahinch, I think, loch in West Ireland, in West Galway, which was part of his estate. And this old tower here is an old tower from the Vikings. The Vikings built it as a watchtower nowadays, and then it was just a ruin. I think it's actually gone now, but back in the day, it was used as a prison for animal abusers. And particularly anyone caught beating a donkey, it seems. He was particularly harsh on people who beat donkeys, and he would roll these people out himself. He would judge them, convict them, sentence them, and then himself, and then roll them out to the little tower here, lecturing them all the way on the evil of their deeds and telling them how long they could expect to spend there. And they would be out there for weeks or months. They would have food and water, but nothing else. So it was the world's first known prison for animal abusers ever, and it's in the west of Galway, and it was run by Richard Martin, who
probably the world's only. I mean, you said only there, question mark, because I don't suppose there's many of those.
I would say there is no more, but I didn't have time to
really
detail on that. So I
wanted to ask you about, Mark, about Humanity Dick, because apart from your account of him, which you can see parts of it coming up, it seems that the official version has been quite sanitized. I mean, for a start off, I mean, I've never heard Hair Trigger before to describe him. And he did seem to be a bit of a lad, didn't he? Really. So
he was, he was very much a flaneur, which he was a roving dandy with loads of money in his back pocket. He was really fond of dueling, so that's where the Hair Trigger name came from. He had a very short temper, and he was involved in over 100 duels in his time. One of which involved dueling against a guy who had shot a dog of a mutual friend of theirs, who had shot dead a dog of theirs, of a friend of theirs, and he challenged him to a duel. They both ended up shooting each other in the face. In fact, I think I've got an illustration of that somewhere.
Yeah, you do. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
So before the Martin Act became law, and when harming animals was still considered sort of okay, or it was only damaging property rather than a sentient being. So there was a situation where this guy here, a guy called Fighting Fitzgerald, another gentleman thug from the area, shot dead this dog here that was belonged to Lord Altamont, and was then challenged to a duel by Richard Martin, and they both shot each other in the face. But because ballistics and all that were quite weak and different back then, they actually just had to be escorted off the.
I love the dramatic.
yeah, right.
Actually, hi, Deb. Welcome along. How did he make his money? You're being asked.
He made his money from exploiting his tenants. He was in the top 1% of the top 1%. He was incredibly well off. A very rich man, very privileged, but he did use some of his privilege to a good ends, which is a lot more than I can say for the likes of Fighting Fitzgerald or any other of his kind in his class at that time.
Like an early philanthropist, really, wasn't he?
Basically, yeah. So he had his flaws, and he was part of a system that was deeply cruel and dysfunctional and violent itself. But he took a stand for animals, and he was genuine about it. And he pushed through a bill that protected all farm animals from unnecessary cruelty, whatever that is. And he pushed it through a very reluctant, hostile, and probably bemused Parliament at the time. I would say half of them voting on it at the time were either drunk or asleep, I would say, because it sailed through.
Nothing much has changed then. But didn't you say in your previous, except bulls? So what was that?
Yeah, except bulls. So it prohibited unnecessary cruelty against all farm animals except bulls. I don't know why he had this. Why bulls were left out if they were considered to be exempt from such treatment, because such a treatment was endemic in the way they were used anyway. I'm not too sure. It doesn't explain why. He was very, very soft on donkeys and didn't care much about bulls. Again,
unless those were the ones that were attached to the plows quite a lot because of their strength.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So I guess if they were included in the act, it might have shut down farming completely. The way factory farm chickens are excluded from animal welfare laws, I would imagine these days, you know. So he pushed through this bill. It became an act, and then he set up his own police force. This was before any police force existed at all. It was about 5 years before the formation of the Metropolitan Police. He co-founded the RSPCA. So the RSPCA are the world's first police force of any kind, and they were set up specifically to enforce the Martin Bill, the 1820 9 bill or whatever it is, to strictly enforce that, to prosecute people who were inflicting unnecessary suffering on animals. So they would hang around Smithfield's meat market and spot for any breaking of that law, and then try and prosecute these people. It took 16 years since the law came into force. It took 16 years before the first successful prosecution took place, and it was so famous. It was so unique. There was this famous painting done of it, and here's the guy being prosecuted. His name is Bill Burr. He was caught beating up a donkey, which obviously to Richard Martin was the worst thing you could do. So he prosecuted him, and he was forced to bring in the donkey to show the wounds on the donkey's body to the magistrates and to the judge to bring home exactly the severity of the crime. And it was successful, and Bill Burr was fined. And then in a bit of a twist, and you would think he wouldn't want to do this, but Martin offered to pay his fine for him, and his stated intent was that he wanted to set a precedent rather than to punish an individual. So make of that what you will. I would have thought that after 16 years of trying, he'd have been really keen to put the boot in. But anyway, it's the same. He was a man full of compassion, even for the wrong people, I'd say at times. But
then Bill Bailey went into comedy after that, so that's
he did. Yeah, so
Dennis is saying there's a one-man play on Humanity Dick by a teacher from Galway City.
Okay, the slide. If I just go back here quickly, this guy here was doing a one-man play on Humanity Dick back in Galway about 10 years ago as well, and I forget his name, but that's where I got the photograph from. And this is him doing his dueling pose for that. So yeah, so Humanity Dick is still a famous character, and rightly so. He was really ahead of his time. So if we go on then so that was the very, very start, the very beginning of a civil and a state response towards the problem of violence against animals or dysfunctional. It was the first attempt to address.
Mark, before you go on, there's one thing I noticed in the book, and I couldn't resist writing it down. It said the RSPCA, where rescuing dogs and cats while eating chickens and pigs makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
And I really wish that a lot of modern day animal advocates would understand that just as with Humanity Dick, the kind of fox hunting donkey lover kind of thing. It's not a contradiction in terms of that cultural. I mean, this is just part and parcel of cultural speciesism. I just wish that people would understand a bit more, because at the moment the modern movement seems to have got its knickers in a bit of a twist about the RSPCA. It doesn't quite understand it as a traditional welfare group. But there you go.
Yeah, anyway. I think just a quick point on that. Since its very formation, it's had these fault lines baked into it, these incongruities and these inconsistencies. And I think that all came to a head during the 1970s, perhaps in the UK, when there was an attempt by factory farmers and fox hunters to infiltrate the RSPCA. And
successful too. There were a lot of them in there.
And they were able to join, as were ALF types, and vie for control over the board of the RSPCA, because there's so many millions in their bank account that both sides wanted access to it. But both sides had no problem joining and being part of that organization. Fox hunters and ALF militants could both join the RSPCA. It was that of a broad church, and it was that inconsistent in its philosophy. It could accept both extremes. So the RSPCA has always been a hypocritical organization, and probably always will be, because it's operating within the welfare mode rather than rights mode. So unfortunately, that's the case.
Yes, indeed. Okay, so this is where you go through all those ridiculous alternatives to the word vegan, right?
There were so many of them. So when the Vegan Society started in 1944, and Donald Watson and co. were coming up with a new name for themselves. I mean, interestingly, the word vegetarian, I think, initially did mean vegan, and then it became pure vegetarian. And then as the sort of philosophy evolved over thousands of years in India with Buddhism and Jainism and Taoism and all this sort of stuff, vegetarian became to mean someone who consumes dairy and eggs, but not meat. So initially, vegetarian did mean vegan, but because the Vegetarian Society didn't want to have a vegan offshoot, and they insisted that they set up their own society, which is the best decision the Vegetarian Society ever made, I think, was forcing the vegan movement to stand on its own 2 feet and separating itself from the vegan movement, because it is a very different movement, really. So original or initial suggestions for the term vegan or non-dairy consuming vegetarian was what we see here: a dairy banner, Benevorian, Pythagorist after what's his name, Grahamite, which was the Sylvester Graham. Pythagoras was his name. Sylvester Graham was a famous vegan that led a lot of the movements in the 19th century in the US. So Grahamite was considered. Beaumanjurian, I don't know what that means. I presume it's French. I don't really know where they came up with that one. Neo-vegetarian and so on. So I think we dodged the bullet and they picked vegan, which is a great term, to be honest.
So some of those sound like a medical condition to me, Mark.
Yeah, Benevorian, a dairy banner. It's probably the worst, But so here we are. We're all vegans, and
I've got terrible Sanivore today.
A Sanivorian burger. So so we can thank our lucky stars. So the evolution of the restaurant culinary scene in Ireland is really interesting, and I kept coming across these gems of history that I'd never known anything about, and I was completely stunned by the fact that I didn't know anything about them, and no one I knew involved in animal rights or politics knew anything about this either. So let me explain the close connections between the initial vegetarian restaurant movement, and we see some adverts for it here in the 1890s and so on, and they're set up by the Vegetarian Society. They didn't last long, but these were the first expressions of vegetarian culinary scene in Ireland. And then we move on to McDonald's. So one of the first ever vegetarian restaurants was part of a chain set up by a Northern Irishman, and it's now a McDonald's. It isn't that specific McDonald's. That's a McDonald's I think it's in Whitehall after one of the May Day demonstrations passed by it. But yeah, I just put that up there so. The very first woman that we know, this is Jenny Wise Power, and she set up the second vegetarian restaurant, which was called the Home Farm Produce Cafe, and it was on Henry Street in Dublin. And there's a little plaque to it still here. The restaurant itself is now I think it's a health food store, but it's where the restaurant was a gathering point and an arms dump for the Republican movement at the time. So this is just prior to the 1916 Rising. And 6 of the 7 people who signed the Declaration of Independence signed it in that restaurant, in that vegetarian restaurant, over presumably plates of vegetarian food, where they would meet Indian revolutionaries and nationalists who were over studying in Dublin, because Dublin, obviously, in Ireland was part of the empire at the time, as was India. So you had a lot of middle-class Indians who were vegetarian by religion. They were coming over to study at the bar in Dublin and to be medical students. And because they were vegetarian and there was only 1 or 2 vegetarian restaurants in Ireland at the time, both in Dublin, they used to go to the Home Farm Produce Cafe and meet with IRA and IRB activists who were plotting the same sort of thing in Ireland as they were thinking of in India. So the radicals of both countries were meeting in this one place, this Home Farm Produce Cafe on Henry Street. It was full of guns and bombs being stored in the basements. It was revolutionaries and poets and philosophers and so on upstairs sharing vegetarian food and discussing
guns, bombs, and veg. So is that plaque still there then, Mark?
Yes, it's still there. Yeah, it's still there. Yeah, so you can see
there Henry Street.
And it just mentions on a Henry Street, and it doesn't mention that the restaurant was a vegetarian restaurant. It just mentions that at this site was where all these people signed the Declaration of Independence, which is one of the most important landmarks in Irish history, really. And it all happened at the vegetarian restaurant. Now, the Home Farm Produce Cafe closed in the mid 1920s when Jenny Wise Power left to become a senator in the Irish Senate, and World War II happened, obviously, and this put a freeze really on the vegetarian movement worldwide, I would say, including Ireland. So the story picks up again post World War II in the mid 1940s, and again I came across this evidence of a woman called Moira Henry, who was from Dublin, and she was probably one of the original punks before punk came along. She used to make her own clothes, her own makeup. She was a vegan, and she was the Irish representative for the International Vegetarian Union's annual conferences. The International Vegetarian Union was usually a vegan movement, but it referred to itself as a vegetarian union. So here she is under the blue arrow, Moira Henry. There isn't much known about her life other than she was a known character around Dublin. She was known for her own makeup and clothes and her own style and being vegan. And at that time, I would say she was one of maybe a dozen vegans in Ireland. It was a very, very small movement. Very little is known about her. But she must have found life very isolating and hard, I would say, in Ireland at the time. There was very little understanding or appreciation for the philosophy of animal rights. Catholic Ireland and Catholicism has a notion called dominion, which apparently grants the human race a superiority over everything else. And that has poisoned relationships with animals ever since, really, particularly in the Catholic world. So she was fighting against, she would have been considered to be a contrarian and antisocial. It wasn't just odd, it was deemed to be a hostile rejection of social values, I think, as much as anything else. It put other people on the spot, and I'd say she had a hard time.
A rebel with a cause.
Absolutely, and more strength to her. So I was coming across these people, and I really wanted to celebrate their lives. Otherwise, they're sort of lost to history. The information is there, but it's so fragmented and piecemeal that unless it's compiled together, like I've done in this book, it's easy to ignore. So.
Can you, just as a matter of interest, you see that appreciation in the middle? Can you remember where that's from?
The one, yes, it's I don't know. It's RG. I don't know who RG is. I presume it's someone else who was involved in the animal rights movement at the time. But that's all that's there. It's from a newspaper. It's an obituary. No, I don't know exactly who RG is. Sorry. Yeah.
Do you remember the publication, Irish Times or something? I suppose?
I think it's the Irish Times. It is the Irish Times from 1997 here. This the obituary at the very end. So if it isn't, I'll let you know. But yeah, if you have a look.
A super vegetarian.
Super vegetarian was another word for vegan, which I quite like. Here's another character, Iron Man Jack McClellan, the Belfast Bulldog. This guy pioneered, as far as I can tell, he was one of the pioneers, if not the pioneer, of a multidisciplinary sports sort of guy. He was a polymath. This guy. He was the champion boxer, footballer, tennis player, runner, and most notably a swimmer. He was this all-encompassing sort of ultra athlete where he would do these mega swims like across Galway Bay or from Tory Island to the mainland, in the North Atlantic in winter and stuff like this. He was real powerhouse. He was a vegan. He's from Belfast. Set up his own chain of health food shops. Very involved in the vegan movement at the time, and uses. Bear in mind that the science around healthy eating and plant-based eating and everything else was very, very primitive and often very wrong at the time. So he was experimenting and proving to the world by using his own body and pushing his body to its absolute limits on a plant-based diet. He was proving how resilient and how healthy a plant-based diet can be. And this is back in the 1950s. So very, very early on, this is when these ideas were barely heard of, and he was proving the power and the endurance of having a plant-based diet. And this guy won award after award. His swim across Galway Bay attracted more people than John F. Kennedy's appearance in Galway the week before. There's hundreds of thousands of people who come out and cheer him on. These days, hardly anyone knows about him. The very scant bits of information I found about him were scattered across these obscure sports websites where they would mention his winnings and all the medals he won and all the championships he won, but never mention the fact that he was vegan. So it was weird. I don't know if they didn't know this themselves, or if it was information that they didn't want to carry on sort of publicizing or what. But there should be statues to this guy everywhere. He was one of the original sorts of strong men of the sort of Iron Man of the whole vegan movement, and he was really proving the opposite of what a lot of people would have assumed that a plant-based diet was all about. So Jack McClellan, he died in 1996. Again, a lot more should be known about this guy, and it's hardly there at all. So again, the book was a good opportunity to bring together these disparate bits of history. So if we move on, okay. So again, sort of carrying on the story of the vegetarian vegan culinary movement in Ireland during the 1980s, and really all along, it's been associated with radical politics. So here up the top, you have the Dublin Resource Centre, and that had the well-fed, I think it was, cafe there. The Hare Krishna movement has always been associated with vegetarianism. They aren't actually vegetarians; they're prasadivores, which means that their food has to be approved by Hare Krishna. And Hare Krishna doesn't approve of eating meat, but loves the consumption of dairy. In fact, I think it's the food of the gods. So I think they have 3 restaurants in Dublin now.
Govinda's. They're down to 1 now, Mark.
Down to 1, okay.
Well, I was going to ask you a question about it, funny enough, because when I first came to Dublin, there was those 3 dotted around the city. And then there was the rise of the vegan restaurants, and then seemed to be that they started to peter out. So maybe it was the fact that Govinda's and Cornucopia was about the only place you could go at one point.
Yes.
But then that changed, so that might have been it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, they specialize, and they probably still do, in sort of vegan slop, really, or vegetarian. It was curry and rice and stuff like this. And they used to always be turning up at festivals. I remember seeing them every year. They'd have a tent at Glastonbury, and it was free food as long as you listened to their chanting and stuff like that. So they sort of mean well, but they have this weird idea about milk being the fruit of the gods, and they're all right to have cows, and they allow the calves a certain amount of time to get some of the milk from their mom, and then they take the rest. They have this weird way of going about getting their milk. If I was them, I'd just go to plant milk, and I would get rid of the.
Yeah, well, this site is the middle. What do we call it? Can't remember the road now, but I can take you to it. I can't remember the road. Right. Abbey Street. That's it. Middle Abbey Street, and they're at the moment they're trying to open a kind of a Himsa farm for that very reason, that they want to get this so-called Himsa milk. You know. It's quite interesting what you said there about they claim that God designed cow milk for humans and not just the calf.
Yeah. It's weird, isn't it? Right. So it's weird the way people do these mental convolutions to get over the trauma of the practices that they're engaged in, and they come out with these weird ideas that So this is what they're into. They're all right if you like vegetarian curry slop and all that, but they've been on the peripheries of the scene really since forever. Even in the hardcore punk movement, there was a strain of Hare Krishna hardcore, and bands that were playing really fast punk, and they're all vegan and into Hare Krishna. There's a band
that's quite interesting. One thing that you might not know, Mark, which is the fact that Govinda's used to be, a vegetarian and vegan kind of restaurant, but the main signage was vegetarian.
Yeah.
And sometimes it still is. But now, in terms of their window displays, they've now got vegan and vegetarian.
Yeah.
So there's been a switch. So that's pretty good.
Oh, it's clear that the vegan movement has overtaken the vegetarian movement for the first time in its existence in the last, I'd say, since 2015. There's been a revolution in this, and veganism now is really where it is at, and vegetarian is yesterday's news, really. Do you remember back in the day when being a vegetarian was the most radical thing you could be? People were like, oh my god, this is, and they would consider it to be this radical Marxist or something like that. And nowadays, so the Overton window has shifted dramatically, I'm glad to say. So I hope that people, and that the vegetarian scene is being bypassed by the vegan movement, and I think that's been reflected in examples.
Well, another thing you may not know is that the Irish Vegetarian Society have just voted to become the Irish Vegan Society.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, that is interesting. There was a similar debate that was going on here for a while. Actually, the New Zealand Vegetarian Society was making sounds about becoming a vegan movement, but they flipped back and they've dug their heels in, and they're now a vegetarian movement only. But it is interesting to see that it used to always be the vegan movement was the little cousin of the vegetarian movement, which was always much bigger, numerically and financially and all that. Now that's changing as people's priorities shift in the right direction. So if we move on to the next slide here, we have the famous Gyro's vegetarian vegan cafe, which was connected to the anarcho-punk Warzone collective up in Belfast during the 1980s and 1990s. It was a premises in the city centre of Belfast that was given to these bunch of punks that turned it into a gig venue and a recording place and a screen printing workshop and a vegetarian vegan cafe. And it was going for years. It was the only place in the centre of Belfast at that time that had anything going for it. The rest of the centre of Belfast was surrounded by sandbags and soldiers and helicopters and CCTV, and there was no social scene there at all because of the communities just sort of kept apart, and the city centre was like a war zone and all that. So you had Warzone Cafe and collective in the middle of the city, and it was probably the only place at the time where young Protestants and Catholics could get together in a violence trouble-free place and have a really good time, and no one cared about your religion or your background. I think it was the only place at the time that provided that, and it was famous around the world. I've never been there myself, unfortunately. It stopped and started a few times. It isn't going at the moment, but it had a run of about 18 years in total, and was a vital part of the Northern Ireland punk scene.
It looks like a pretty small stage there, Mark.
I'd say there was barely any stage there at all, but there was some brilliant bands there. Fugazi and all sorts played there. So it was a world famous venue despite its size. The atmosphere there, I'd say, was something else. Given the context. So as I say, the vegetarian culinary scene has always been intertwined with the radical politics scene of Ireland and elsewhere, basically for over a century. So it's interesting to see that vegetarianism and veganism has always been seen as part of a wider struggle, as part of a wider liberation project. It isn't a be all end all in itself. So we can see that going right back to the days of Jenny Wise Power, right up to Gyro's and beyond, including the Key Co-op in Cork, which was the huge, big, rambling building in the middle of Cork City. It's still there. It's a restaurant, cafe. It used to be a bookshop. I don't think they're doing that anymore. But it was where I was exposed. Me and my friends were exposed to all the Peter Singer's Animal Liberation was there. You could buy magazines from the Class War organization, all sorts of things. It was the only place in Cork and probably in Munster that where you could buy soy milk and radical literature and books and so on. And there was it's still going on, and it really was a beacon of hope in Cork at the time. It was intimately involved in the access to abortion, the anti-ban on divorce, all sorts of the socially progressive movements that were around in Cork at the time. It was the Key Co-op that provided a physical meeting space for all of that to happen, and it's still going on. Interestingly, the initial causes that the Key Co-op is fighting have largely been won, and now they've moved on to other causes. So as I say, the Overton window in Ireland generally has shifted enormously, and now you can get divorced, you can get abortion. There's the LGBTQI and all the rest of it. It's really progressed an awful lot in terms of animal rights and socially generally. And the Key Co-op has been at the heart of all that in Cork. So it was deemed to be it was often getting raided by the police, and because of the pro-Republican sort of stuff that you would get in there. It would get attacked by local skinheads at times. So it did attract trouble. These days it's fine. It's been on the scene for 30 or 40 years, so it's fine now. But at the time, it was often it was treated with hostility by the public at large often. But yeah, it was really the centre of radical politics in Cork then and now. on to the next slide then. We have the very first vegan place ever in Ireland was a pop-up restaurant called Seduced, run by this woman here who was Brazilian, I think. I can't remember her name. But yeah, it was a periodic raw food, vegan, organic pop-up restaurant. So a very, very limited, very, very niche market there. It didn't last for more than a year, but it was the very first, and this is in 2013. This was.
It was very expensive as well, wasn't it? I don't know if
Pardon?
It was very expensive. I remember that.
Okay, yeah, it probably was. I would say, yeah. So yeah, it was the first attempt, and it didn't last. I think it was too narrow in its appeal, perhaps, and a bit early.
It was the kind of I always call it kind of for food snob type things, you know.
Okay.
Little bitty plates with a bit of drizzle and all that. The kind of stuff that I don't. Now here's a question, Mark, which I don't know whether you want to take on this or not. Was there religious overtones to the hostilities, i.e., the troubles, I suppose?
So the hostility. To the Key Co-op or to the movement generally, or
I think it might have been you mentioned about Belfast scene, I think maybe.
Oh right, there was I would say no, there wasn't. I would say the religious reaction, whether it was Catholic or Protestant, both considered veganism particularly to be a slap in the face of Christianity and to be a rejection of Christian values. Sort of bizarrely, but to take a stand against animal suffering was seen, I think it's still often seen as being an anti-Christian stance, specifically perhaps an anti-Catholic stance. We have dominion and we have superiority over everything that crawls and flies and swims and walks on the earth. Dominion, and it's in Genesis, and Catholics and Christians always repeat this, and they quote the Bible, and they're right. The Bible does say that, and that's why we should reject the Bible. But it does say that we have dominion, that we are supreme. It's a form of it's the ultimate snobbery. It created a species of such snobs that we don't even consider ourselves to be animals. We are that disconnected psychologically from our roots, from reality, that a lot of people, a lot of Christians and Catholics do not consider themselves to be animals. So to treat animals with respect, I think they saw it as bringing humans down to the level of animals, and that was all wrong.
Denigration. It's the same with animal rights. Some people think it's a denigration of human rights, but you still get a lot of pushback to the idea that we're animals.
It's a lot less these days because it's such a dumb position. But I remember hearing it all the time when I was growing up. That we weren't. There was animals and there was us. It wasn't clear what us were if we weren't animals. It was never sort of delved into. But we weren't animals. Animals did their thing and we did our thing, and we were more like gods, really. I think.
Yeah, we were a divine creation. There's a good book called Unnatural Order by Jim Mason, and he's got a concept called dominionism, which is really good. Goes into that in a lot of detail.
Yeah. So as I say, it has poisoned our relationships with non-human animals ever since, and it is expressed in its rejection of things like veganism. So Seduced was the first short-lived vegan restaurant in Dublin. Nowadays, according to Happy Cow, when I checked, and this is as of mid-2023, there was 13 dedicated vegan restaurants and cafes in Dublin alone. So it's just blown up beyond all sort of imagination, really. No one, particularly the vegans in the 1980s and 90s, ever saw this coming. I mean, at least me. I didn't expect the movement to have such success in some spheres, as it has done. The availability and quality of vegan food in supermarkets and in restaurants has changed beyond all recognition from when I was a teenager. Now every restaurant or cafe that's worth its salt will have maybe even a dedicated vegan menu, whereas back in the old days, the only thing you could get was chips and a salad and a side plate of contempt, especially if you were out in the countryside. Nowadays, there's so much going on,
Well, I guess there might still be the urban-rural divide, but even that has broken down a little bit.
It is fading. It is fading, and these guys are helping it fade. You know, there's now a thing called a vegan butcher. There's a guy called Sova, he's a vegan butcher inside in Dublin there. Blazing Salads obviously have been on the scene for years. And they're pioneers as well. They've written a bunch of books on vegetarian cooking and vegan cooking. And so from the, it really has blown up. Now for the next bit,
Mark, before we go on, we've gone 50 minutes. This might be a time maybe to.
I think you're right, because it goes into a very different sphere.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. If it goes into a different idea, just before we go, and in fact, we were going to talk about the definition of direct action, but we could do that next week because it's more relevant. Okay. But just before we go, what about you? What's your story, Mark?
Okay, so I've been very involved in animal rights since forever, really. I went vegetarian when I was about 13, and it was a very instinctual thing. I didn't grow up I grew up in a conservative Catholic family, city and country, very Catholic dominated. I go into the psychology of the country I grew up in quite a bit in the book, and I describe it as essentially a fascist type society. It was what fascist groups aspired to. Highly Catholic, highly authoritarian, highly intolerant country. So out of that, despite all that, came a radical wing. Part of that was interested in animal rights. And when I became exposed to the punk movement, bands like Crass and Conflict, who were banging on about these issues really earnestly, and it really caught my ear, and I got really interested in the politics around animal rights. I became vegetarian when I was 13, just out of an emotional response. I think that I hadn't been exposed to anything. I didn't go into a slaughterhouse. I wasn't raised on a farm. It just seemed like a good idea. And then the politics of the anarcho-punk movement really impressed me, and I got involved in the movement then after being exposed to those records. Basically, a guy in school came in one day with a bag full of these albums, and I was pinned to the wall by the energy and the anger and the fury and all the rest of it. And I've been pinned to that wall since.
Even the covers of the Crass records,
they're
massive, didn't they? Yeah,
absolutely. So. The big fold-out posters and all that, and they in themselves were manifestos. The fold-out album covers. So it really blew my mind for a person who was only exposed to Catholic Ireland type stuff to be then exposed to Crass and their thinking. There's such diametrical ways of looking at the world. It was so enchanting as a young person, and I got really drawn to that. And so I got involved in the Irish Council Against Blood Sports, found them way too moderate and mild. There wasn't any movement worth its name really in Ireland at the time. When I moved to the UK in my mid-20s is when I really got involved in the Hunt Saboteurs. But when I was in Galway in the early 90s, I set up a Hunt Saboteurs group there as well. I had a bit of experience going out a few times with the Scottish Sabs, so I knew sort of what I was doing. So it started off in Ireland for a season of Hunt Sabotage. We had the shit kicked out of us, and then when I moved to the UK, it was a very different scene. It had been going on for about 35 years at that point. So the initial flurries of violence, to an extent, had sort of died down. Things were a bit more stable in terms of the dynamics between.
I think it depended where you were, but
it depends entirely where you were. Exactly,
and
that could change in a dime.
Yeah, they almost came to accept the Sabs.
That's right. Yeah, they were part of the thing, and they'd say hello to you and all this. And I was so unused to this because the Irish sort of situation, it was so new there that you were surrounded by violence all the time. There wasn't any niceties or pretense to be civilized at all. So I was quite taken aback initially by the relationships between the local hunt and the Hunt Saboteurs. Obviously, as I say, that can turn. There was plenty of violence in the UK as well. In fact, there was people killed in the UK. So it's a big story. One that I can go into more detail next time, because we're coming into that
Yes, indeed. And so, yeah, so that's really kind of, you've created the kind of groundwork there for us, which is really brilliant. Okay, so what we're going to do, folks, is we'll do part two, and it should be part two and last part next week at this time, same channel, same time, and but also the day before on World Vegan Day, I'll be doing a special which will include the time tunnel interview with Wendy McGovern, which we didn't do for last week. So, Mark, it's been really interesting, and I've seen the PowerPoint. I'm ahead of the curve in that sense, and I do know that what you're going to say next time is even more dramatic stuff than so far.
Yeah,
because there's been a lot of kind of welfarism and everything, and then it's going to go into animal liberation in a big way next time.
That's right.
So I want to thank you very much for being here. I want to thank everybody for watching. So if you just sit tight there, Mark, while we finish, and then we can sort out what we're going to do for next week. So thanks again, everyone, for tuning in, and we'll see you again. Bye for now.